Back in the studio with me, my good friend Will Reishman. He's an investment advisor, and he also tracks all the geopolitical things. A pretty passionate guy when it comes to all of these issues. And Will, delight to have you back.
Good to be here, Perry.
Good to see you. And you know, a lot to talk about. By the way, we're going to open up the phone lines a little bit later on. You're more than welcome to ask Will a question while he's here. He'll be with us for a good half hour or so. And the phone number, if you have any questions on some of the things that we're discussing, is 541-776-5368. Well, this morning, Will, the job numbers came out. Said 96,000 jobs added. That made the unemployment number go down a tad, but it also went on to say that 368,000 people have left the workforce. And then there's another number here that I haven't heard reported on, that 69.9% of the labor force participation rate for men is at the lowest level recorded since U.S. government began tracking these numbers in 1948. This is serious.
Well, what we have is a disconnect, really. We have a lot of companies that are looking for employees and they can't find them. You hear reports of that frequently. People are not qualified enough for a lot of the jobs that are available. And so, frankly, Perry, this is the result of a generation of easy money. But most importantly, the last 15 years. And I think the best way to look at it is look at the housing bubble that created tremendous numbers of jobs in construction, remodeling, mortgage brokering, etc. And when the housing bubble burst, those jobs were eliminated, never to return, because they were effectively created by an artificial force of lower than proper interest rates. The natural interest rate was driven well below where it should have been. That was Alan Greenspan and then subsequently Ben Bernanke's response to the bursting of the tech bubble in the year 2000. Explicitly, Mr. Greenspan explicitly wanted to create a bubble in housing, and in fact he's quoted as saying that. He wanted to create a bubble in housing to offset the damage done to the economy, in his mind, by the bursting of the tech bubble in '99 and 2000, and the big crash that occurred on Wall Street with the tech stocks that were 200 going down to $2 or whatever. And that created a boom for a while, and certainly we here in the Rogue Valley experienced that greatly. And we had a lot of great job growth, et cetera, but it was artificial. It was based on something that wasn't a natural result of a healthy, organic, growing economy.
So what is the gap then between those who are looking for work and the companies who are looking for employees? Is it job qualification?
I think it's training, perhaps in advanced machining, for example, computer-controlled. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I don't. But most of the jobs being created today are minimum wage jobs or close to it.
So I guess that would be categorized as service jobs. Okay.
Service sector jobs.
Okay.
You know, we invested in too many shopping centers and not enough development of natural resource industries. Right. You know, we sent too much money to Wall Street and not enough money to entrepreneurs on Main Street. You know, and that's what an interest rate driven economy does. Money flows to those sectors where there's a quick buck to be made, because when the value of money is cheap, it circulates rapidly in the economy, and it moves to if you will, money manipulators rather than to long-term investors and entrepreneurs.
The opening moments of the Democratic National Convention, the national debt tripped $16 trillion.
Poetic. Poetic.
Okay.
Just.
You know, I mean, I don't know if you could orchestrate that any better, but it did happen. But in spite of the tongue-in-cheek on that, that's a big number. Can we handle this?
Perry, that's not the tenth of it.
Okay.
There is so much more debt. What is a debt? Well, the 16 trillion identifies the number of bonds that the U.S. government has sold. But the government has another form of debt, effectively a moral debt, if not a political debt. It isn't a contractual obligation, perhaps in the same way that a bond is. Right. But these are the debts to the Social Security recipients, not present recipients only, obviously,
Right.
but all those that have been paying into the system for their working life, whether they're 62 or 22. Medicare, Medicaid, Medicaid especially, or Medicare especially, government pensions. There's various numbers you see depending on how they're calculated. Somewhere between 100, the low 100 trillion, over $200 trillion of debt that we have.
So
if you count this, what's called unfunded liability, and this is the way a corporation would be judged. If you judged a corporation, they would be accountable for their unfunded liability, for their pensions, for their health care obligations.
Right.
That's called GAAP accounting, General Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP.
Right.
And the government now has to report their GAAP accounting. They don't headline it, but that was one of the good things that occurred under Mr. Bush, President Bush, was that GAAP accounting is now required. They report it, although it's not headlined. Mm-hmm. And the GAAP deficit is about $100 trillion.
So the way they handle unfunded mandates is basically dependent upon cash flow. I mean, in other words, they have to pay into it, but they don't have the reserve to pay it all right now. So you got to have the cash flow to make it happen.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, add to that, you got
but
the
if you were a prudent person, you'd be reserving today to meet those future obligations.
Yeah. So
and instead, we're on a pay-as-you-go system, which continually means that our current obligations is just going to soar.
Right.
Unless they're reduced.
So do you, kind of a snapshot, do you see in the future more cities, potentially states going bankrupt because they just can't afford it?
I don't think there's any choice unless you're going to, I mean, you know, you might ask, is, if you will, Illinois our Greece? You know, is California our Spain?
Oh.
You know, are we going to federalize all of these obligations, or are we going to seek some other solution? And under the present American system, I think we're going to federalize them. Okay. I think that's the inevitable, either that or we're going to begin to establish precedents for the effectively renegotiation of some of these entitlement obligations. It's the only way out, you know, either one or the two. You're going to federalize the whole mess and inflate it away by just completely debasing the U.S. dollar, or you're going to have to meet, you know, reality and begin to renegotiate some of these promises because they can't be paid. It's just a fiction.
A couple of other questions along this line. Personal debt added to the national debt. So, I mean, the whole culture's in debt. If you add credit card debt on top of national debt, I mean, we're past the point of potentially saving ourselves, aren't we? And I don't say that to be negative, but to look at it realistically, the whole world's in debt to one person or another.
True. Well, the thing is, you know, I mean, some of the things that if we were to talk long enough, you know, some of the things that we might arrive at or discover would sound pretty negative. You know, they'd sound, oh, that's, you know, I'd be so pessimistic or whatever. The thing is, it's reality. We have lived beyond our means, many families, yes, but certainly the country. We've lived beyond our means, and we're going to have to retrench. Eventually, there's no choice. Now, we can either postpone that, or we can do it sooner than later. I think a gradualist approach, and frankly, I think the Romney-Ryan approach, represented more by Mr. Ryan's proposals that have, you know, been sort of developing over the last few years, is too gradual. But it's a whole lot better than avoiding the issues altogether. And it could be that they're simply doing as much as they can in terms of communicating the solution. They're doing as much as they feel they can do politically in the short run. When they get into office, when they're really, God willing, and they're confronted with the reality, we can only pray that they'll rise to the occasion and be as forthright with the American people as, you know, and truthful. The problem is that it will make things worse in the short run.
I don't know of a nation that doesn't have these problems, some to a greater degree than others, but it seems like the whole world, every nation's got some kind of a cash flow, debt, economic problem. The United States just this week was downgraded from number 5 in competitiveness to number 7. So is this a house of cards, a domino effect? If one country goes, it's going to hit us all? Because It's not just us, it's the whole world's upside down.
Correct. To some extent, I do think that we helped cause this problem.
The United States?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it emanated a lot from the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve's irresponsible policy, not just recently, but for a longer period of time. And the disease caught. Now, excuse me, that's true certainly for China in some ways.
The disease being what? Borrowed money?
Right, an overdependence on credit and an easy monetary policy. You see, interest rates shouldn't be controlled by some central authority. It's a Soviet-style system that we have in this country. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, when you have a committee of people sit together and decide what the interest rate ought to be, that's the most important single price in any economy, any free market, is what you're going to charge for money. It drives every other cost in the economy. And for a committee of people to sit together and think they have the wisdom to determine what that number ought to be is ridiculous.
Yeah, well, the Federal Reserve is not the United States federal government. Yeah. Well, I mean, Romney says Bernanke's the first guy to go if he's president. I mean, so?
Well, but he's not going to. He actually, his term is not up until 2014. Now he may.
Can he fire him?
I don't. Not. No. He may pressure him out.
Okay.
I don't know that. It's never happened. I mean, at least not in that I recall ever. Well, some Federal Reserve.
But Newt said during the debates, I'd fire him. I mean that's.
But,
you know.
Anyway, I don't think he can. But obviously, Europe has a socialist system. Socialism is inherently inefficient.
Right.
You know, so there's no question that Europe, has created some of its own problems. I don't mean to suggest that everything has emanated from the Federal Reserve in Washington, but we have certainly accelerated this process to the point. Without going into detail, the Chinese were devaluing their currency to keep up with the devaluing of the dollar. With all, so there was a sense in which the Federal Reserve's policies were affecting the accumulation of debt in other countries. But there's no question. You're right, Perry. The world has one big credit boom that is now continuing through the overcreation of government debt. There, for a while in this country, the overcreation of debt was mortgage debt. We had an enormous bubble in mortgage debt beginning in the late 90s and continuing on into 06, 07. It was incredible if you look at historically the numbers of how much mortgage debt we had at every year, and then all of a sudden it just ballooned. And
well, what's interesting about the mortgage thing, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about it when we come back from the break, and that is that it was interesting to see the Freddie Mac and the Fannie Mae problem. Obviously that was the bubble. But now when the homes go up for repossession and they're recycled back to the bank, they get caught in the bank. And I don't know what happens in there, and the bank does nothing with this property, and then all of a sudden it goes for about a third for the asking price. I mean, somebody's really taking a hit here. And what did the banks do? Why can't the banks, what federal regulation was over a bank that prevents them from taking a repossessed piece of property and turning it faster?
Well, I mean, I don't know all the answers to, even to some of the details. The thing is, we have a situation where we have become increasingly socialized. The government, in my opinion, created a problem. Interest rates that were well below their natural level created this boom in housing. Then we have a crash. But we don't let the crash run its course.
We rescued the crash.
Eventually, you've got to just say, look, this isn't working. Get the government out of the way. The problem is, it will mean we'll have a very severe recession for a protracted period of time, and there'll be a great deal of, and the politicians will get unelected.
All right, let me.
But until you let this is a lot like a guy that's an alcoholic, and his family knows he's an alcoholic. You want to help him, and you keep having liquor all over the house, but he's not supposed to touch it.
Yeah. Okay.
You've got to remove the credit. You've got to remove this funny money from the system and just let the guy have a crash.
You know what it is, Will? It's so complicated, and you understand it. Few do. But it is so complicated that the average citizen cannot get their head around it. And there's a careful balancing trick of emotions and facts. And in politics, you learn how to work one against the other, what people are feeling and what the facts really are. And that's a whole nother show that we can do someday. But the average person out there knows something's wrong, know that it's a big mess, hasn't got the foggiest idea how we got here. Everybody wants to blame somebody, but right now I think we've come to the point is, what is really the way out of this mess? And
I think Paul Ryan had it half right, at least, and that is, when you're spending money you don't have, stop.
Yeah, it was the old saying, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Yeah.
But they don't go far enough. The root of the problem is the Federal Reserve. It isn't just an incidental. It isn't a corollary. It's not an auxiliary issue. It is the heart of the problem. And there's another Paul that had that one right, and his name is Ron.
Yeah.
He had it right. That's the heart of the problem. And until you address the unsoundness of the money, the fact that we're living on a sea of sand. Yeah. Our money is sand, not rock.
All right, let me take some questions here as they come in.
To quote a book that you're familiar with.
Yes, yes. Hi, James. Go ahead. What's your real estate question?
My real estate question is, why has it been considered wise to set real estate to market to the market as almost like the god of the market, like the market's always right? And also, the Part B question is, why has it been assumed that being 30 years in debt for real estate has been wise? I think in some instances people are paying 45% of income. The big question is why are people why are people so concerned about the economy when they're paying 45? People are paying 45% of income for housing, whereas in 1964, people were paying 25% of income for housing.
Okay, that's a great question. I think what he's saying there.
I'm not sure what the first question was.
Well, the first question is, why is real estate somewhat the market bearer of values? In other words, somebody puts a value on that house and that becomes the value. I mean, how reliable is that? I mean, if you look on real estate spreadsheets today, it'll say what the land and the building is valued at, and then over here it'll show a market variable on how much that thing's gone up and down. Who sets that value and why?
Well, I mean, ultimately, real estate on any given, it traditionally on any given transaction has been a classic free market transaction. In other words, willing buyer, willing seller, we meet, we have a transaction. Today you have a market that's quite a bit distorted, partly because of the foreclosures, the overhang of bank-owned properties, et cetera. You don't really have the same kind of natural market until this all, quote, clears. There's one thing that I think we in America have to recognize is that after World War II, we subsidized housing very explicitly as a national policy with the unlimited mortgage deduction. It was an explicit policy of the government to subsidize housing and to encourage housing. We have overconsumed in housing in the United States like no culture in history, and certainly no modern culture. You go to Europe, you see much less investment in housing. You see people with a higher standard of living, a high standard of living, and yet they live in a very modest home, because that same cultural bias even, and that same political decision was not made in these European countries until somewhat more recently. In Spain, there was a huge incentive to promote housing.
Well, the other part of his question was, and I think he's probably right, I don't know exactly, but today 45% of your income goes to housing. In 1964 it was around 24%. Was that a cultural shift? Because I know a lot of people went out and built and bought big houses during the boom with one thing in mind: this thing's going to go up in value and I'm going to sell it one day and make a ton of money.
I'm going to flip it, right?
Yeah, I'm going to flip it. And that didn't happen.
Well, I mean, I think that's effectively a symptom of what I was just mentioning. We have politically made the decision to subsidize housing because we thought that that was a great place to promote a healthy economy. But the government, it was a government policy. So anytime you got government promoting something, right away you kind of assume that it's something you're going to have a bad outcome, because it shouldn't be involved at all. It should be now, I'm not saying there shouldn't be some mortgage interest deduction. Traditionally there has been, but perhaps that ought to be one of the tax reform measures. Get rid of the mortgage deduction, or at least put a cap on it, so that you can't just have. But I think what you're talking about there, 45 versus 25. I recall 30. It was roughly 30% of your income when we were first buying homes. I think that's really a policy decision as well through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, that they'll accept 45% as a threshold because we need to keep the housing market from crashing.
Okay, so
it's a further means of government subsidy.
Yeah. All right. A couple of things before we run out of time. We are seeing an awful lot of advertisement today. And I hear plus and minuses on this. If you listen to some of the big money advisors, buy gold. Some will say, no, stay away from it. Some will say it's an indicator. This morning on Drudge, I saw a little article down in the corner there that Mr. Putin is stockpiling gold. What's the story on gold?
Well, Perry, we're in a world where...
Oh, by the way, and there's another story that popped up that the Republicans are considering going to the gold standard.
Well, that, quite candidly, and without discussion, that was a sop to the Ron Paul supporters. There's no way that'll go anywhere.
So that was just
that was just a way to
say a candy bar to them. Okay.
Exactly. There's no doubt. That's all it was.
Okay.
It's not at all, because again, if you don't talk about the Federal Reserve, it doesn't make a difference what you say about gold.
Okay.
The Federal Reserve is the issue. Then maybe gold. We're in a world right now where the investment arena, if you will, the investment environment is so completely distorted. And it goes back to the same thing, the artificially low interest rates. I was talking to this young man the other day, this kid that did some work for me. Anyway, long story. I remember back in the 50s when I was mowing lawns and taking my money down to the savings and loan, that I was getting 4 and 4.5% on my passbook savings account. Just a kid walking in with 10 or 15 or $20 every week or two to save it. Today, you can't get that on any length of CD, no matter how long you tie your money up. Even if you have $100,000, you can't get 4 or 5%. And yet we have inflation that's every bit as higher than it was in the 50s, even though the official inflation rate today is not all that high. It's higher than they say, by quite a bit. But even the official inflation rate, the inflation in the 50s was as low as it's been in American history. And yet I can still get 4%, 4.5% on my passbook savings. We have destroyed the incentive to save. We've destroyed the incentive to save. That's been a conscious policy. People's money is too important for them to put it into the market. The Federal Reserve takes pride, and Mr. Bernanke has been quoted even recently in a speech last week as taking pride at how his policies have boosted stock prices. Well, the unspoken message is we've driven interest rates down so low that you have no choice but to speculate in the markets, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, even if you have no experience at it, even if it's not right for you.
You're going to get a higher risk, but potentially a greater return there than you ever will by just saving.
Well, especially if you can only get 0.5% for a year or two.
Yeah, right.
So the point is that we are jumping a few steps of logic, if you'll forgive me for the sake of time. There are almost no sound investments that you can make if you want to be safe and preserve your wealth. So the paper money system is being debased aggressively, and that's one of the reasons why gold is up today. I assume it still is. I haven't checked in the last hour. Gold in euros is almost at an all-time high because of the weakening of the euro. People are looking for something where they can store wealth.
All right, I'm going to run out of time. So the bottom line on gold is what? You think it's a good investment?
I think that's a place to store wealth.
Okay, it's at what, 17 now, something?
Last I saw was about 17.25. Let's say.
Where do you think it'll go?
I think it'll be at least twice that price within the next 3, 4, 5 years. Really? 3,500 is, I'd say, a minimum target. I'm sorry to be so. No. I try to give a thorough answer, and then we run out of time.
Where do people get a hold of you?
What you have to do is buy something they can't print, Perry.
Yeah.
Because they're printing all around the world. You made that point earlier.
Yeah.
The Europeans obviously started that yesterday. The Chinese are printing. The Japanese are going off the chart. The British are printing. We're going to start printing again next week. We're going to renew our printing program. And that's not a place to store wealth. Is in paper.
Where can people get a hold of you? Want to talk to you?
Our office number is 773-7774.
Will Reishman. Thanks, buddy. Come back.
Well, I'm sorry we didn't get
No,
a little more thorough in our answers.
No. It's complicated. All right, we'll take a quick break.
God
We'll be
bless
right back.
everybody.